Hello everyone, my name is Gabriel Manrique Surra, and today I'll be explaining why hate speech laws in Canada are more needed today than ever before. First of all, it is important to acknowledge that the discussion about how effective or necessary hate speech laws are in a free democratic society such as Canada is one that is based on how much trust we should place on the general public's capacity to support reasonable stances on controversial topics. To this, I would like to say that I completely understand the opinion that advocates for free public debate, even with the inclusion of hateful positions towards specific groups in society, mainly because of the belief that human beings are reasonable creatures. It does seem logical that if one has this belief, then one should trust that when people are confronted with an inclusive and reasonable position versus an extremist and hateful one, that people will naturally choose the former. And while I do believe this would be the case if there was a completely neutral public platform for political discourse, the reality just isn't that. The reality of our modern world is that social media platforms dominate public discourse, either for better or for worse. Now, considering this fact, as well as the fact that all of the main social media platforms that Canadians currently use to gather their thoughts on relevant topics and voice their opinions about them work under the same algorithm, an algorithm that purposefully limits a person's viewership to content of their interest, I will deem it necessary to enact some sort of legal limit as to what kind of speech is acceptable in public debates. Now, having said all this, I will proceed to give specific examples as to why these laws are needed today. All right, so a key component to take into consideration when discussing what groups will be affected by the implementation of hate speech laws in Canada, or that already have been affected, is the history of racial discrimination that exists in most, if not all, countries within the American continent, Canada, of course, included. This historical fact is relevant to this discussion, as certain language has been used for centuries as a way to reinforce inaccurate and hateful stereotypes of African American people, Indigenous people, Asian people, among other racial groups. Considering the multicultural identity of Canada and the importance of maintaining a healthy social cohesion amongst different groups within society, it becomes apparent that if language does have the ability to reinforce dangerous ideas, which it does, then it should be properly managed or regulated in such a way that avoids unnecessary conflict or discrimination between peoples. This should be considered a necessary step towards establishing a proper path of rectificatory justice for racially discriminated against groups within Canada and North America as a whole. Ignoring the history of the detrimental use of derogatory language against specific racial groups within Canada and allowing these types of speeches to continue would be a complete disregard of all the initiatives that have attempted to correct the negative legacy of racial discrimination. So essentially, if Canada wants to keep its international reputation of being one of the most welcoming countries in the world and continue to progress in its journey towards reconciliation, it needs to regulate hate speech. Another important group that will be directly, or that has already been directly affected by the implementation of regulation of speech in Canada is, of course, women. It is no secret by now that there has been a clear pattern of gender-based discrimination against women throughout the development of most human societies in history. Once again, Canada not being the exception to this. And with this pattern of marginalization has come a use of derogatory and hateful language that has been used to oppress women's autonomy and reinforce their subjugation to men. Once again, it becomes apparent that if language can cause this kind of damage to certain groups in society, then it should be properly regulated. A concept that is relevant to this discussion is substantive equality, the belief that the true equality can only be reached by recognizing the pre-existing differences among different groups in society. This modern concept of equality and justice is key in recognizing why hate speech laws in Canada are so necessary, as it is not enough to guarantee a right of free speech for everyone to establish a sense of equality in the population, but it is only by acknowledging the language-based discrimination that has negatively impacted specific groups in society, such as women, that we can truly begin to develop a proper concept of equality in Canada. If Canada wants to continue to promote equality between genders, races, and all kinds of groups within society, then it must start by recognizing the specifically detrimental effects of hateful speech against women and try its best to make sure that that kind of rhetoric isn't allowed in public debates. At the end of the day, what is important to recognize when discussing the topic of hate speech laws in Canada, and whether they should be implemented or not, is that Canada's national identity is composed of a combination of many different cultural, ethnic, gender-based, and religious groups. Every single one of these groups has their own unique set of beliefs and values, and they should all have the ability to exercise their view of life as long as it doesn't violate the basic human rights that the Canadian state stands to represent and defend. It is also crucial to acknowledge that many of these groups have suffered from discrimination in the past, and that some of them are still dealing with the consequences of such discrimination. Now, having considered all of this, as well as the fact that derogatory language has been used to reinforce the ideas that have kept many of these groups in their disadvantageous positions, it seems only natural to suggest that language limitations should be put in place in order to protect these groups from previously used discrimination tactics. Looking at it from this perspective, hate speech laws in Canada should be seen as external protection for historically disadvantaged groups who are currently trying to achieve a state of equality and peaceful coexistence within Canada. Added to this, it is even more necessary to implement these types of policy now, considering the dangerous nature of the social media algorithm and how easily it can spread hateful and extreme forms of thinking that will only tear our society apart. Canadians have always prioritized the good of society before destructive forms of individual freedom in the past, and I believe this should not be the exception. If anything, hate speech laws will only continue Canada's journey towards actual equality and justice, as well as reinforce this country's strong sense of multiculturalism, inclusion, and acceptance. Thank you.